So, the United Nations just made a move that is seriously shaking up the world of global politics. We're talking about a historic vote that could give a whole new level of international recognition to foundational Black Americans. That's the term for the descendants of people who were enslaved in the United States. Let's dive in and break down what just happened and why this is such a huge deal.
And this quote right here from FBA lead advocate Tariq Nasheed gets to the absolute core of the entire movement. You see, the argument isn't about being a minority group. It's about being a nation within a nation. And that one idea reframes the whole conversation. It shifts it from a domestic civil rights issue to an international justice issue. And now, with this UN vote, that argument has just been put on the global stage.
Okay, so what did the UN actually vote on? Well, it was two major things. First, they have officially granted Foundational Black Americans, or FBA, observer status. Now, that alone is a pretty big deal, but the vote also greenlit the start of formal talks for something way more radical, a dedicated seat on the UN Security Council. For a group that isn't a state, that is, well, it's completely unprecedented.
Now, the specific wording of the resolution is everything here. It was pushed forward by a group of Caribbean and African nations, and it does a lot more than just hand out a title. It legally frames FBA as a distinct historical population with a unique justice claim. That language right there, that's the legal and moral bedrock for everything that's supposed to come next.
So this brings us to the million-dollar question. I mean, observer status is one thing, but a seat on the Security Council, that's a whole different league. How would that even begin to work for a group that doesn't have, a country with borders on a map?
The whole UN system, its entire structure is built for nation-states. So the big puzzle is, how do you fit a group that's defined by its lineage and history, not by land, into that system? Well, the proposal that's on the table is pretty fascinating, because it tries to do exactly that.
All right, let's look at how they've designed this thing to actually be workable. The most important point, the one that makes it even possible to discuss, is no veto power. That's the big compromise, right? But don't think it's just for show. This seat would have real teeth, full speaking rights, and, get this, the power to introduce its own resolutions. And the delegation? It would be elected internally by the FBA community itself. This creates a totally new model of representation that's all about influence, not control.
And the seat's proposed job isn't to weigh in on every single global crisis. Nope. It's laser-focused on the issues that are central to that unique justice claim we talked about. We're talking about reparations, anti-Black state violence, and the legacy of slavery. And what's really crucial is that the UN would be required to consult this new body on things like international policing standards. That gives it a direct voice in actual policymaking. It's a really targeted, kind of surgical form of representation.
To really get how radical this is, just look at the other non-state observers at the UN. You've got the European Union, which is a collection of countries. You've got the State of Palestine, which represents a nation trying to get full statehood. But the FBA proposal, it creates a brand new category, a lineage nation that exists inside another state, making its claim based on historical justice, not territory. It's a totally new precedent.
So, what is the core argument for getting this unique status in the first place? Well, FBA advocates say the justification is rooted deep in history and economics, and that it makes their claim unlike any other in the world. This quote really just cuts right to the heart of it. The argument is that foundational Black Americans aren't an immigrant group. Their presence in the U.S. was the direct result of a violent, forced trafficking operation that they argue was fundamental to building the country's wealth and power.
And this brings us back to that key concept, lineage nation. This idea is a game changer because it completely sidesteps the usual debate about land and borders. Instead, it defines a nation by a shared, specific historical journey, from the violence of the slave trade through the oppression of Jim Crow all the way to today. As a political concept, it's incredibly powerful and, frankly, brand new.
This also answers that big question you might be thinking. Okay, but why should FBA be treated differently from other historically wronged groups? Their argument is that their uncompensated labor wasn't just some domestic issue within America. They say it was the seed money for the entire modern global economy, directly enriching the very Western powers, the US, the UK, and France, that now hold permanent seats on the Security Council.
Now, as you can probably imagine, a vote like this was not met with universal applause. The international community is pretty sharply divided, with really strong feelings on all sides of the issue. The official reaction from the United States was, let's say, deeply cautious. When diplomats start talking about complex constitutional and diplomatic questions, that's usually code. What the U.S. is really signaling is its core concern, that this kind of international recognition could fundamentally challenge its own national sovereignty and its control over domestic policy.
But then you immediately contrast that with the view from a West African ambassador. For supporters, this isn't some messy complication, it's a long overdue correction. It's about taking what has always been framed as a domestic issue for the U.S. and rightfully placing it where they believe it belongs, on the international stage of human rights. And supporters in the Global South, especially in Africa and the Caribbean, see this as a potential catalyst. They're hoping it can spark tangible, coordinated action. Things like joint frameworks for reparations, international truth commissions, and a unified global front against systemic problems like police violence.
On the other side of the coin, you have the classic slippery slope argument. And this quote from an anonymous European diplomat captures it perfectly. The big fear is that this sets a precedent that could just open the floodgates, threatening to totally fragment the UN system as countless other groups start demanding their own seat at the table.
So with all these competing views, where does this all go from here? Look, the vote was a monumental first step, but the path to an actual functioning Security Council seat is anything but a straight line.
This powerful quote from advocate Tariq Nasheed just perfectly captures the symbolic weight of this whole moment. From cargo to council. Wow, that one phrase reframes the entire effort, not as a plea for a handout, but as a demand for a correction to the historical record and to the global power structure itself.
But the road from that symbolic vote to a real-world reality is going to be a long one. It's going to require intense, tough negotiations to actually amend the UN's core procedures and create this new kind of chair. And most importantly, it will almost certainly face major resistance from some of the Security Council's most powerful permanent members who might just see this as a threat to their own authority.
And that's where all of this leaves us. This historic vote has fundamentally changed the conversation. A door to international recognition that was once bolted shut is now officially open. So the profound question the world is now watching isn't if FBA will be recognized, but just how far that door will be allowed to swing. Thanks for tuning in.